Sentry mode activated. Target acquired.
Hey there, hunters. Yep, still going hard on this Remnant from Hell mod. I've been enjoying the challenge, and as I've said, mods breathe new life into games, and I'm just loving all these changes in the mod. It really brought me back to why I love Remnant so much. It just feels really good to play. It's kind of like Destiny. It's been the same game for like a decade, but the combat loop is just so good. Like, that's what's hooking people. And Remnant kind of has its hooks in me again for the same reasons. Anyway, I'm testing more builds here in the From Hell mod, and there's so many new items and rebalance items to work with that I'm just going crazy over here. So I wanted to work on something that wasn't mod power or shotguns, because I do tend to gravitate towards those builds, and I'm sure it's getting old. So today we're going to be taking a look at automatic weapons, and we're going to be showcasing and building around those in the new necklace, the Velocity Core. I'm going to be calling these the Autocannon builds, named after the gun attached to the A10 Warthog. So the reason why I wanted to work with the automatic weapons is because they're pretty bad in Remnant historically. I mean, some people use them and they're not so bad that they're like useless, but they've always just felt like a step down compared to like shotguns or single shot weapons. They never really stood out as like overpowered weapons. Except that one time before the Subject 2923 DLC where like Radiant SMGs was like the build. Anyway, they just took too long to empty their magazine and reload, and they just kind of felt janky. And honestly, they're not that much different here in the From Hell mod, but they're a hell of a lot more fun. So let's take a look at these builds, which is going to be the heavy armor variant, mostly used for enemies with no weak spots. And yes, they are still pretty similar to the standard Radiant Swarm builds in regular Remnant. The typewriter and the machine pistol are going to be paired with the Radiant armor as always. It's been a no-brainer in the past, due to how they synergize with the crit stacking buff from Radiant armor and their high rate of fire. Though you can also use the SMG instead of the machine pistol. The main difference between standard Remnant and the From Hell mod is this neck, the Velocity Core. Now what this amulet does is that when you stop moving, you get a buff for 2.5 seconds that doubles your fire rate, increases your damage, and increases your reload speed. But it also doubles your recoil, and I gotta say, double recoil on the typewriter is a lot of recoil. It's really hard to manage. But this amulet kind of changes the entire way you play, because now you have to stop and go constantly, which makes for extremely high risk, high reward gameplay, especially on the Hell difficulty, where there are tons more enemies and you die in 2 hits from everything, so standing still, kinda scary. The double fire rate is crazy. I mean, it's effectively double DPS, but there is still one thing about this amulet that I don't like. So when you do stop moving, there is a very slight delay between stopping and then getting the buff activated. It's not a lot, but it's not instant as well. This makes reloading kind of annoying, because you're trying to get that 50% increased reload speed to be active when trying to reload the typewriter, but since the buff isn't active during a roll or slightly after a roll, you have to stop and wait briefly for the buff to turn on before you start your reload. Because if you don't, you start the reload animation and then the buff triggers, and it doesn't actually increase your reload speed, because you can't change your reload speed once you start it. You have to do like another, reload while the buff is active. So you can kind of waste it. So yeah, it's kind of weird and a little bit of a letdown, but still the amulet is great regardless. So to pair with this, we're still using the Provisioner's Ring, just because the auto reload while weapons are stowed does save us a lot of time. We can still quickly swap between the two weapons most of the time without reloading, but due to Velocity Core's increased rate of fire, we will eventually empty on both weapons, which is why I prefer the machine pistol, as it has a faster reload. We could use more damage rings, but honestly I find Provisioner's Ring far more useful, especially when it takes a whole clip to drop a monster at times, and we don't want to be caught in the middle of a big swarm of enemies having to reload both our weapons. You're gonna die. I know I'm going entirely out of order with showing the set and the equipment and stuff, but bear with me. I have one ring slot in the mods left to discuss, but let's cross over to the other armor setup first. So let me talk about the armor and weapon choices really quick. Like I said, Radiant machine guns has pretty much been a no-brainer thing forever, but I honestly can't deal with the heavy roll. There's so many more enemies on From Hell mod, and you really can't get hit by anything or you're gonna die. Heavy rolls tend to get hit by follow-up attacks from enemies and is susceptible to getting mobbed. So for this other version, which is the light setup, I opted for Hunter armor just for the light rolls at first, but then seeing as how this setup gains bonus weak spot damage, it really does shine as the second half of the same build, since Radiant doesn't really care for weak spots at all, it's all crit. And honestly, it's fine, and Radiant is still a viable option, and I've kind of branched this build out into 2 different sets. Their damage is pretty similar, to be honest, and it's really depending on what you're fighting is going to determine what set's going to be better or not. Hunter armor is going to be doing more damage to the bosses and enemies with weak spots readily available, but Radiant armor will do more damage against enemies that don't have weak spots, or at least not easily accessible ones, especially when you throw on Burden of the Gambler. So I'd say both options are fine, and you kind of have to change around depending on what you're fighting, but Hunter requires no uptime on the armor buff. It's pretty consistent, and you have the light rolls. The Radiant armor actually just does a slight bit more damage overall because it actually has more fire rate and has a little bit more crit damage. With the two armor versions out of the way, let's talk about the mods in the last ring slot. For the weapon mods, there's actually not too many good options here, sadly. We do spend most of our time just shooting, so there's not much time to use mods, nor are we scaling mod damage at all. So stuff like Song of Swords and Hunter's Mark are probably your best bets for the Hunter setup, but I actually like to run Riftwalker as it's pretty much a get out of jail free card, and it saved my bacon more than a few times. If you're using Radiant armor though, we can also use the Swarm mod, as that will crit and hold up our armor's buff essentially as long as the mod remains active, which is nice. Hunter's Mark is almost non-negotiable though. It's not just for the free crit boost, but because we can see enemies, it gives us an easy time prioritizing targets, which is actually really important for this build because we're going to be sitting still a lot, and that's really dangerous. But other than that, you can pretty much use whatever you want in your other slot. And then with all that together, we have one ring slot left. And yeah, it's a tough choice actually. For the Radiant setup, we can use the Mantis Ring since we're going to have to be standing still anyway for Velocity Core. It grants bonus fire rate and critical damage, which the entire armor set is based off crits anyway, so I mean yeah, it's good, it's free damage, there's basically no downside. We can also use Burden of the Gambler against enemies with no weak spots, as it's all free damage there. An Empowering Loop is always a good choice too. We don't notice the loss of fire rate due to Velocity Core, and it's just a nice fat chunk of base damage. For the Hunter armor setup, Empowering Loop is still a great choice, but you can also swap it out for Ring of Flawless Beauty against enemies that have weak spots, and that's basically going to be the two builds. You know, they're the same build, but there's two differences: weak spot damage and non-weak spot damage. They function the same, but work better on their respective targets that they can abuse. So the entire build is focused still on using the Velocity Core with the automatic weapons, but there's a lot of variations on how you can build it, and it performs very well in both ad clear and boss killing. There's not too many negatives about this build though, except for the part where we have to stand still to use Velocity Core, which can put you in bad positions. Other than that though, the only downside is that it has issues with ammo management because you're just dropping whole clips at a time, and you're gonna need ammo boxes for the most part, unless you just, get really lucky and pick up a lot of ammo, but stock up on ammo boxes if you want to use this. But yeah, that's basically what I just wanted to show you. I wanted to showcase the new Velocity Core and how it affects the SMGs and their playstyle, and just how this build performs now on the Hell difficulty, which is actually really solid across the board. I'm not really a person that uses these weapons, but I'm pretty impressed with it. But that's all for me, so thank you all for watching, and good luck out there, hunters.